The soft glow of Keith's bedside lamp cast a warm bubble of light in his otherwise darkened room. Outside, the city had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Distant car horns, the occasional siren, the hum of his apartment building's ventilation system. Inside, there was only the whisper of his ceiling fan and the occasional rustle as he shifted position on his bed, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. It had been a particularly grueling day at the research lab. His eyes burned from staring at screens and microscopes for hours on end. Now, he welcomed the silence, the solitude. Sometimes, he wondered if he spent too many evenings like this, alone in his apartment, with only digital connections to keep him company. But tonight, the solitude felt right. Comfortable, like an old sweater. Keith set his phone aside and reached for the paperback on his nightstand. He had been trying to finish this same science fiction novel for weeks now. The irony wasn't lost on him. A biologist reading about aliens when he spent his days studying the most minute details of earthbound organisms. He smiled to himself as he flipped to his bookmark page. 3 pages in, he heard it. A knock. So faint that at first, he thought it might have been something falling in the apartment next door. But then it came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. 3 gentle taps against his door. Keith froze, glancing at the clock. 11:42 p.m. He wasn't expecting anyone. His building had security, and visitors had to be buzzed in from a lobby. He set his book down slowly and slid off the bed. "Who is it?" he called, approaching the door cautiously. No answer came. Just as Keith was convincing himself he had imagined the whole thing, the knocking returned, soft but unmistakable. Keith peered through the peephole, but saw only a distorted blur of color and light. Curiosity overrode caution as he unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Standing in the dim hallway was a woman. At least, she appeared mostly woman-shaped. But no human woman had ever looked quite like this. Her skin glowed with a subtle lavender luminescence, as though lit from within. Her features were delicate, with high cheekbones and an almost heart-shaped face. But it was her eyes that truly betrayed her otherworldliness. Large, iridescent, and impossibly deep, like looking into tidal pools that somehow contained entire galaxies. They shimmered with an intelligence that made Keith's scientific mind race with questions and his human heart quicken with inexplicable emotion. She wore what appeared to be a flowing garment that seemed to shift in color with each subtle movement. From deep purple to midnight blue to something beyond the spectrum Keith could properly name. Her hair, if it was hair, moved slightly as though underwater, despite the still air of the hallway. Keith realized his mouth was hanging open, and he struggled to find his voice. Who? How did you get in here?" The being tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unfathomable eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried a musical quality, like chimes in a gentle breeze, though with an undercurrent of something mechanical or digitized. "May I sleep beside you tonight, human?" Keith blinked rapidly, certain he had misheard. Or perhaps this was an elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He pinched his arm discreetly. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I sleep beside you tonight?" she repeated, her luminous eyes reflecting a vulnerability that seemed strangely universal. "I require comfort." Keith's mind raced through possibilities. A prank? An escaped mental patient? Some kind of performance art? But the soft glow of her skin and those eyes. No contact lenses or makeup could achieve that effect. And there was something in her demeanor, a mixture of uncertainty and raw need, that touched something instinctual within him. Whatever or whoever she was, she didn't seem threatening. Just lost. He realized he had been silent too long when she began to turn away, her shoulders drooping slightly. "Wait," Keith said, surprising himself. Yes, you can come in." She turned back, those extraordinary eyes widening slightly. Keith stepped aside, holding the door open wider. As she passed by him, he noticed she moved with an uncanny grace, her feet seeming barely to touch the floor. The air around her carried a faint scent he couldn't identify, something like ozone mixed with lavender. Once inside, she stood in the center of his modest studio apartment, looking around with undisguised curiosity. Her gaze lingered on his bookshelf, his cluttered desk with microscope and stacks of research papers, the poster of the Andromeda Galaxy on his wall, and finally, his rumpled bed. Keith closed the door, leaning against it slightly as he tried to collect his thoughts. The situation felt surreal, but he forced himself to remain calm. Do you have a name? She turned those luminous eyes back to him. In your language, you may call me Megan. Megan, he repeated, feeling the ordinary name sit strangely against her extraordinary appearance. I'm Keith. An awkward silence fell between them. Keith gestured vaguely to the small couch in the corner. Would you like to sit down? Megan moved toward the couch with that same floating grace and perched on its edge, her posture unnaturally straight. Keith pulled his desk chair out and sat across from her, trying to appear more collected than he felt. Are you not from around here? He asked, immediately feeling foolish at the absurd understatement. A slight smile curved her lips. No, Keith, I'm not. She seemed to consider how much to reveal. My vessel encountered difficulties. I cannot return to my people for some time. Your vessel? Like a spaceship? The words felt ridiculous coming out of his mouth, but nothing about this situation was normal. A crude but functional comparison. She glanced toward the window, where the city lights twinkled beyond the glass. I have been observing humans. Your species fascinates me, especially your sleep rituals. Sleep rituals? Keith echoed. The way humans seek comfort in proximity during rest. Her gaze returned to him, intense and searching. The sharing of space, the physical closeness. On my world, we rest in isolation. But I have observed that humans find peace in togetherness during their most vulnerable state. She hesitated, her light dimming slightly. I find myself in need of such peace. Keith struggled to process this. So, when you ask to sleep beside me, I require a period of energy regeneration, she explained. What you would call sleep, but I find myself unsettled, alone. A flicker of something like embarrassment crossed her features. I have been observing your dwelling. You live alone. You seemed kind. Under normal circumstances, Keith might have been disturbed to learn he had been watched. But there was something so vulnerable in her admission that he could only feel a strange sort of compassion. What exactly would this involve? He asked cautiously. Proximity, she replied simply. Nothing more. I wish to experience the comfort humans derive from shared rest. Keith ran a hand through his hair, still trying to convince himself this was really happening. I guess that would be okay, he said finally. Do you? How do you normally sleep? Or rest? Or whatever you call it. Megan tilted her head again, considering. Our regeneration state is typically done in specialized chambers. But I can adapt to your human methods. I have observed enough to understand the basics. Keith nodded slowly, looking toward his queen-sized bed. Well, that's where I sleep. It's big enough for 2 people to have their own space. Megan followed his gaze, studying the bed with scientific curiosity. She rose with that same fluid grace and approached it, extending one slender hand to touch the comforter. A look of surprise crossed her features. It's soft, she said, with what sounded like wonder. Yeah, that's kind of the point, Keith replied, finding himself smiling despite the strangeness of it all. Comfortable is good for sleeping. Megan pressed her hand deeper into the mattress, watching with fascination as it gave way under the gentle pressure. And these? She gestured to the pillows. Those go under your head, Keith explained, moving to stand beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. They support your neck while you sleep. Megan reached out again, her fingers brushing against one of the pillows. So soft, she murmured again, her voice carrying that chime-like quality that made something in Keith's chest tighten. And the blanket, he continued, pointing to his comforter, keeps you warm while you sleep. Warmth is pleasant for humans during sleep? Megan asked, her attention fully focused on this new information. Generally, yes. He found himself relaxing slightly as the conversation shifted to something more educational than existential. Our body temperature drops a bit when we sleep, so most people like to be warm. Megan nodded seriously, absorbing this information with intense focus, like a student memorizing important facts for an exam. There was something endearing about her earnestness, her genuine curiosity. Would you like to sit on it? Keith offered, gesturing to the bed. To see how it feels? Megan hesitated only briefly before carefully lowering herself to sit on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes widened as she bounced slightly, testing the give of the springs. A look of pure delight crossed her features, transforming her from ethereal being to something almost childlike in her joy. "This is most pleasant," she declared, placing both hands on either side of her and bouncing deliberately. Keith couldn't help but chuckle at her reaction. "I take it they don't have spring mattresses where you come from?" "Our regeneration chambers are designed for efficiency, not comfort," she replied, still bouncing slightly. "This is inefficient but superior in many ways." Keith sat on the opposite corner of the bed, maintaining distance. "Sometimes inefficiency has its own rewards," he said with a small smile. Silence fell between them again, but it felt less awkward than before. Megan continued to explore the textures of the bed, running her luminous fingers over the comforter and pillows with fascination. Keith found himself watching her, struck by the juxtaposition of her otherworldly appearance and her very relatable curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Keith ventured after a while. Megan looked up from her examination of the pillowcase fabric. "You may." "Why me? There are millions of people in this city. Why choose my apartment?" Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of what might have been pain. "I have been alone for longer than is advisable for my species. My research mission was meant to include others, but circumstances changed." She looked down at her hands, which seemed to pulse with a softer glow. "I observed many humans before selecting you. You live alone, but seem content in your solitude. You speak kindly to the elderly woman with the small canine companion when you encounter her outside this building. You leave sustenance for the feral felines behind your dwelling." She met his eyes again. "You seemed least likely to respond with fear or violence to my appearance." Keith felt a strange warmth spread through his chest at her words. The idea that this extraordinary being had been watching him, evaluating his character, and found him worthy of trust was oddly touching. "Also," she added, with a slight tilt of her head, "your security system was comparatively simple to bypass." Keith laughed despite himself. "That's both concerning and good to know, I guess." The conversation lulled again, but the silence now felt companionable rather than strained. Megan seemed content to continue exploring the textures of the bed, while Keith tried to adjust to the reality that he was sitting in his apartment with what appeared to be an actual extraterrestrial being. "What is it like?" Keith asked eventually. "Where you come from?" Megan's expression grew distant. "Different," she said simply. Then, after a pause, "We value knowledge and efficiency above all else. Our world is older than yours, our technology more advanced. But in some ways," she trailed off, searching for words, "in some ways, we have lost something your species still possesses." "What's that?" Keith prompted softly. "Connection," she replied, her voice carrying a note of something like longing. "The ability to find comfort in another's presence." Keith found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the unexpected vulnerability in her voice. "Your people don't connect with each other?" "Not in the way humans do." Megan's glow dimmed noticeably. "We share information, we collaborate on projects and research. But physical proximity for emotional comfort? This is considered primitive, unnecessary." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I believe this as well, until my isolation began, until I started observing humans." Something in her words resonated with Keith. As a scientist, he understood the value placed on objectivity, on rational thought over emotional response. But he also knew firsthand the emptiness that could come from too much detachment, too much isolation in pursuit of knowledge. "I think even scientists need connection," he said quietly. "Maybe especially scientists." Megan tilted her head, considering his words. You are a scientist? Keith nodded. A biologist. I study tiny organisms, bacteria, mostly. You study life, Megan said, a new note of respect in her voice. This is valuable work. I like to think so, Keith replied with a small smile. Though sometimes I wonder if I spend too much time with my microscope and not enough with actual people. Megan's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps we're not so different, you and I. The simple observation hung in the air between them, creating a bridge of understanding that transcended their obvious differences. Keith felt a shift in the atmosphere, a deepening of something he couldn't quite name. What does it feel like? Megan asked suddenly. Human connection. Physical closeness. Keith considered the question carefully. It's hard to describe, he admitted. Warmth, I guess. Security. Knowing you're not alone in the universe, even for a little while. Not alone in the universe, Megan repeated softly, her eyes taking on a faraway look. Yes, that is what I seek. Keith noticed that her glow had dimmed further, her posture less rigid than before. She looked in that moment, exhausted in a way that seemed universal, beyond species or origin. Are you okay? He asked cautiously. Megan's gaze returned to him, and there was no mistaking the weariness in those luminous eyes. My journey has been long. The adaptation to your atmosphere, your gravity, requires significant energy. And the events that led to my isolation, she trailed off, then added simply, I am in need of regeneration. You need to sleep, Keith translated. Yes, she acknowledged, but I find myself unable to achieve the necessary state. Hence my request. Keith glanced at the clock. It was past midnight now. His own exhaustion was beginning to catch up with him. We should probably get some sleep then, he said, trying to sound casual despite the extraordinary circumstances. Do you want to, change into something more comfortable? I could lend you something. Megan looked down at her shifting color garment. This adapts to all needs, she explained. But thank you for the consideration. Keith nodded uncertainly. I'll just get ready for bed then. He grabbed his pajamas from the drawer and ducked into the bathroom to change and brush his teeth, still half expecting to come out and find his apartment empty. The whole encounter a strange dream or hallucination. But when he emerged, Megan was still there, sitting patiently on the edge of his bed, her glow casting soft lavender shadows across his walls. I normally sleep on that side, he said, gesturing to the right side of the bed. But you can take whichever side you prefer. I have no preference, Megan replied. I will take the other side. Keith turned off the main lights, leaving only the small bedside lamp illuminated. He pulled back the covers on his side and slipped beneath them, trying to act as though sharing his bed with an alien was something he did regularly. After a moment's hesitation, Megan mirrored his actions, carefully sliding under the covers on the left side of the bed. Her movements were precise, as though she were following a protocol she had studied but never implemented. Is this correct? She asked, lying stiffly on her back, hands at her sides over the blanket. Keith couldn't help but smile. There's no right or wrong way, he assured her. Whatever feels comfortable to you. Megan nodded seriously, then experimentally pulled the covers up higher until they reached her chin. The warmth is pleasant, she observed. Good, Keith said, reaching over to turn off the bedside lamp. As darkness fell over the room, Megan's natural glow became more prominent, casting a gentle lavender light that was somehow soothing rather than disruptive. They lay in silence for several minutes, Keith acutely aware of her presence beside him. Despite the strangeness of the situation, he found himself relaxing gradually, his exhaustion beginning to overtake his curiosity and amazement. Keith, Megan's voice came softly through the darkness. Yes. What is the purpose of what humans call fear? The unexpected question pulled Keith back from the edge of sleep. He turned his head to find Megan staring up at the ceiling, her profile illuminated by her own gentle glow. Fear it's a survival mechanism, I guess, he replied thoughtfully. It warns us about danger. But you experience fear even when no physical danger is present, Megan observed. Fear of rejection, fear of isolation, fear of failure. Keith considered this. Those are different kinds of threats, but they're still threats to our well-being. Humans are social creatures. Isolation can be as dangerous as physical harm in its own way. Megan was silent for a moment, absorbing this. And sadness? What is its purpose? Keith shifted to face her more directly. These are pretty deep questions for bedtime, he said with a soft laugh. I apologize if it is inappropriate, Megan said, turning to meet his gaze. I can cease inquiries. No, it's fine, Keith assured her. I just wasn't expecting a philosophical discussion. He thought about her question. Sadness is complicated. Sometimes it helps us process loss. Sometimes it connects us to others through shared experience. Sometimes it just is. And you are experiencing it now? Sadness? Megan asked perceptively. Keith was surprised by the question. I don't know. Maybe a little. He hadn't really examined his own emotions lately. Work had been all-consuming. I guess I've been feeling a bit disconnected. From people. From purpose, sometimes. Megan nodded, as though his answer confirmed something. On my world, such emotional states are considered inefficiencies to be corrected, she said quietly. But I have observed that humans embrace these states, integrate them into their existence. We don't always have a choice, Keith said with a wry smile. Emotions happen whether we want them to or not. Yes, Megan agreed, and there was something in her voice that suggested this was a recent discovery for her. I have found this to be true as well. Another silence fell between them, but felt deeper now, more meaningful. Keith found himself wondering what had happened to Megan, what circumstances had led to her isolation, but he hesitated to pry. I lost my research partner, Megan said suddenly, as though reading his thoughts. In what you would call an accident. We were the only two sent to study your world. Now it is only me. I'm sorry, Keith said softly, understanding now the sadness he had sensed in her. We were not connected in the human sense, Megan continued. But we had worked together for what you would measure as 73 of your years. Their absence is, she paused, searching for the right word, disruptive. You miss them, Keith translated gently. Megan considered this. Yes, she acknowledged, sounding almost surprised. I miss them. Without thinking, Keith reached across the space between them and gently placed his hand over hers. The contact sent a mild, tingling sensation up his arm, not unpleasant but certainly foreign. Megan's skin was smoother than human skin and carried a warmth that seemed to pulse gently with her inner light. Megan looked down at their joined hands with fascination. This is a comfort gesture, she stated rather than asked. Yes, Keith confirmed. Is it okay? It is. Unusual, Megan replied, but she made no move to pull away. But not unpleasant. Keith started to withdraw his hand, not wanting to impose, but Megan turned her palm upward, capturing his fingers in a light grasp. I would like to continue this comfort gesture, she said with endearing directness. Keith smiled in the dim lavender light. That's fine. They lay like that for some time, hand in hand in the darkness, an unexpected connection forming across unfathomable differences. Keith felt himself relaxing more deeply. The warmth of Megan's hand in his creating a sense of peace he hadn't anticipated. Keith. Megan's voice came again, softer than before. Yes. In my observations, humans often lie closer together during sleep. Is this correct? Keith felt a flush of warmth in his cheeks. Sometimes, he acknowledged. It depends on the relationship. Megan was silent for a moment. Would it be permissible for us to lie closer? For research purposes? The last part was added hastily, almost as an afterthought. Keith couldn't help but smile at the transparent addition. If you want to, he said gently. It's okay. After a moment's hesitation, Megan moved closer, careful and precise in her movements. Keith shifted to make room, and somehow, naturally, she ended up with her head resting lightly against his shoulder, her body a gentle curve against his side. The contact was strange at first, her body temperature slightly warmer than a human's, her subtle glow now close enough to cast patterns on his face. But after the initial adjustment, Keith found it remarkably comfortable. There was something profoundly calming about her presence, as though her otherworldly nature somehow made the connection more pure, unburdened by the complications that often accompanied human intimacy. "Is this correct?" Megan asked, her voice vibrating softly against his shoulder. "There's no correct or incorrect," Keith reminded her. "But yes, this is nice." He felt her relax against him, the stiffness in her posture gradually melting away. Her glow dimmed noticeably, which he took to be a sign of her relaxation. "Your heart has a different rhythm than mine," she observed quietly. "Slower, but steady. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Keith asked. "Neither. Simply different." Her voice was growing softer, more distant. "It is soothing." Keith found himself smiling in the darkness. Of all the ways he had imagined his evening going, comforting an alien being with his heartbeat had certainly never crossed his mind. Yet here he was, and, strangely, it felt almost natural. "Thank you, Keith," Megan murmured, her voice now barely above a whisper. "For this comfort. For not being afraid." "Thank you for trusting me," Keith replied softly. Megan's glow dimmed further, her body becoming heavier against his as she slipped toward what he assumed was her version of sleep. Keith lay awake a while longer, marveling at the extraordinary turn his ordinary life had taken, before his own exhaustion finally pulled him under. His last conscious thought was to wonder whether he would wake to find her gone. The whole experience, nothing more than an elaborate dream born of loneliness and too many late nights reading science fiction. Keith woke to the gentle pressure of sunlight against his eyelids. For a moment, he lay still, awareness returning gradually. The weight and warmth against his side registered before memory did, and he opened his eyes slowly, half expecting to find himself alone. But she was still there. Megan lay, curled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, one arm draped lightly across his chest. Her glow had dimmed to almost nothing in the morning light, making her appear almost human, if not for the subtle lavender tint to her skin. Her eyes were closed, features relaxed in a way they hadn't been the night before. She looked peaceful, vulnerable, beautiful in a way that transcended human standards while somehow still meeting them. Keith remained perfectly still, reluctant to disturb her. There was something profoundly moving about being trusted this way by a being so different from himself. A connection that defied explanation or expectation. As though sensing his wakefulness, Megan's eyes opened slowly, revealing those remarkable depth-filled irises that had so startled him the night before. She blinked once, twice, orientation returning to her gaze. "Good morning," Keith said softly. Megan regarded him silently for a moment, as though remembering where she was and how she had come to be there. "Morning," she replied, the words sounding slightly foreign on her tongue. The regeneration cycle was successful. Keith smiled at her clinical description. "You slept well, then?" "Yes," she confirmed, slowly lifting herself to a sitting position. Her shifting color garment had somehow remained perfectly arranged despite a night of sleep. The proximity provided the expected benefits. "I feel restored." Keith sat up as well, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. "Good," he said simply, though the word seemed inadequate for the strangeness and wonder of the situation. Sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds, painting stripes across the rumpled bedding. In the clear light of morning, Keith half expected the magical quality of their encounter to have diminished. But if anything, Megan seemed even more extraordinary, a being of starlight somehow manifested in his ordinary bedroom. "I must leave soon," Megan said, her gaze drifting toward the window. "It is safer for me to move during daylight hours when your species' vision is compromised by the brightness." Keith nodded, feeling a surprising pang of disappointment. "Will you be able to get back to wherever you need to go?" "Yes," Megan assured him. "My vessel requires only minor repairs. Another few of your Earth days, perhaps. And then you'll go home?" Keith asked. Megan's expression grew distant. "No, my mission here is not complete. I will continue my research, but from a different location. It is safer not to remain in one place for too long." Keith wanted to ask more about her mission, about her world, about the possibility of seeing her again, but something in her demeanor suggested that such questions would not receive answers. Instead, he asked, "Was last night helpful? For your research, I mean." Megan's eyes returned to his, studying him with that intense, otherworldly gaze. "It was more than helpful," she said after a moment. "It was illuminating." She rose from the bed with that same fluid grace he had noticed the night before. Keith followed, suddenly acutely aware of his rumpled pajamas and morning stubble next to her perfect composure. "I have observed much about human comfort and connection," Megan continued, moving toward the window and gazing out at the city beyond. "But experiencing it." She turned back to face him. "There is wisdom in your species' need for proximity. A wisdom my kind has perhaps forgotten." Keith moved to stand near her, not too close, respectful of the space between their worlds. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most important," he offered. "Connection, comfort, not being alone." "Yes," Megan agreed, her glow brightening slightly as she spoke. "This is a discovery worth reporting." A small smile curved her lips, "though I will omit certain personal details." Keith returned the smile, appreciating her unexpected touch of humor. Probably wise. They stood together in the morning light, an impossible pair brought together by chance and need, and perhaps something more that neither could fully articulate. "I must go now," Megan said finally. "Your building's other inhabitants will soon be active in the corridors." Keith nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of loss already forming in his chest. "Of course." Megan moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Keith," she said, her musical voice carrying a new note of warmth, "thank you for your kindness to a stranger. For offering comfort without question." "Thank you for trusting me," Keith replied simply. "It was an honor." Megan tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Then, with a deliberate movement that seemed both studied and sincere, she extended her hand toward him. Not in the alien gesture he might have expected, but in the very human offer of a handshake. Keith took her hand gently. The same subtle tingling he had felt the night before traveled up his arm, but now it was familiar, almost welcome. "In your human traditions," Megan said formally, "I believe it is customary to say goodbye at such partings." "It is," Keith confirmed, "though sometimes, when people hope to meet again, they say see you later instead." Megan's eyes brightened with interest. "This implies a future encounter." "It does," Keith acknowledged. "It's optimistic." Megan considered this, then nodded decisively. "Then I shall be optimistic as well." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "See you later, Keith." The simple phrase, in her musical voice, carried a weight that made Keith's heart beat faster. "See you later, Megan." She released his hand and moved to the door with that same ineffable grace. Keith followed, unlocking the door and opening it for her. The hallway beyond was still empty, the building's other residents not yet stirring. Megan stepped into the corridor, then turned one last time. For a moment, she simply looked at him, those incredible eyes seeming to memorize his features. Then, without another word, she turned and moved away, her shifting garment catching the morning light as she went. Keith watched until she reached the stairwell at the end of the hall. Just before disappearing from view, she paused, looking back at him one final time. A soft pulse of luminescence, brighter than before, emanated from her for just a moment, like a silent farewell. Then she was gone. Keith stood in his doorway for several long moments, staring at the empty space where she had been. Finally, he turned and went back inside, closing the door behind him. His apartment looked exactly as it always had. Same furniture, same clutter, same morning light filtering through the blinds. Yet everything felt different somehow, as though the walls had absorbed something of Megan's otherworldly presence. He moved to the bed, still rumpled from their shared night. On the pillow where Megan had rested her head, he noticed a subtle shimmer, barely visible except when the light caught it just so. He touched it gently, feeling that same faint tingle against his fingertips. A smile curved Keith's lips as he looked toward the window, toward the sky beyond that suddenly seemed both more vast and more intimate than ever before. Whatever mysterious research had brought Megan to Earth, to his door specifically, he found himself profoundly grateful for it. For one night, he had connected with something beyond his ordinary existence, and in doing so, had somehow connected more deeply with his own humanity. "See you later, Megan," he whispered to the empty room, surprised to find he truly believed it might be possible. Outside, the city continued its bustling morning rhythm, unaware that among its millions of inhabitants walked a visitor from beyond the stars, a beautiful alien who had sought comfort in human connection and perhaps, in her own way, had offered comfort in return.